Good evening, I'm Terence McKenna. The film you're about to see is the story of almost 2,000 Canadians who in 1941 were assigned the hopeless mission of defending the British colony of Hong Kong against the vastly superior forces of Imperial Japan. That mission cost 557 Canadian lives. Some were murdered, the victims of war crimes. Many others died during 3.5 years of mistreatment in Japanese prisoner of war camps. In this account, actors will portray some of the men and women who were there. The words they speak have been taken from letters and diaries and interviews with those who survived. This series of programs is dedicated to the 46,542 Canadians who gave their lives for their country in the Second World War.
Yeah, there's a pile of British in here, remember?
50 years after the Second World War took them to Japan, 2 Canadian soldiers have come back for a visit. The veterans are preparing themselves for a reunion.
All our Australian buddies up there.
Australians, British, East Indians, and Canadians fought side by side in the Pacific. The returning Canadians can remember some good times, but here they also relive one of the darkest military stories in Canadian history. They've come to see 137 fellow Canadians in Yokohama today.
This is not going to be easy, Robert.
All of those old comrades lie in this cemetery.
Dear Muggs, I'm in the same mood Homer must have been starting the Odyssey.
War isn't like everyone thinks, running up a hill, firing away. It's more like the two of us sitting here, and some son of a bitch 8 miles away says, hey, let's kill someone over there. So they fire a shell, blows everyone to pieces.
The thought that my government would knowingly offer a couple of thousand of its young men as lambs to the slaughter in order to meet some sort of political expediency.
You know, Robert, when you look around here and see these guys, none of them had an easy death.
Even after all these years, it's hard to come back to visit the close friends who were killed right in front of you. Bob Manchester fought as one of the older members of the Winnipeg Grenadiers. He was 25. Bob Clayton was a teenager. When he was wounded in battle, he passed over command of his platoon to his pal, Murray Goodenough.
He won the military medal down at Stanley.
Is that right? Sure.
He's the youngest man here in the whole cemetery. Brits, Australians, he's the youngest man. Imagine that. They look at stones, eh? We look at people.
The details of what happened to these soldiers were for a long time suppressed by the Canadian government. The terrible story is known to very few Canadians. Many Japanese would also prefer that it be forgotten. Across the country from the Yokohama cemetery, another reunion. The 228th Japanese Regiment. In 1941, some of these men were killing Canadians, and not always in battle. A Shinto priest tells them to honor the memory of what they did in the war. These reunions were once held in secret. Now there is an open celebration of the spirit that brought them together for war.
You must demonstrate to the world the true worth of Japanese manhood. His Majesty desires to bring peace in the Far East and set Asia free. You are the point of his sword.
In 1941, Japan was intent on the expansion of its empire. The Imperial Japanese Army began its campaign with a sweep through China, leaving a path of destruction and terror in its wake. The seemingly invincible Japanese troops moved south towards the Chinese border with the British colony of Hong Kong. In early 1941, Winston Churchill said privately that there was not the slightest chance of holding Hong Kong or of relieving it if the Japanese attacked. Eventually, his military persuaded him that it was worth at least a symbolic attempt to hold Hong Kong. But rather than risk more of their own troops, the British decided to ask Canada to take on the job. The first Canadian troops designated for the job were these Winnipeg Grenadiers, assigned to garrison duty in another British colony, Jamaica. Incredibly, Canada answered England's call without making an independent assessment of the peril, accepting the mother country's assurance that the men would not be in harm's way. The Grenadiers had a lot of time to polish their baseball game, but few of them had ever thrown a grenade. Some had never even fired a rifle. Because of their lack of training, they were officially classified by the Canadian Defense Department as unfit for combat. Back in Canada, the Grenadiers were joined by another unit with the same classification, the Royal Rifles of Canada. For security reasons, the 2,000 soldiers had no idea where they were being shipped or what threat they would face. In the lineup was 21-year-old John Payne, an artist and musician. He was born to be a soldier. His father was a British corporal who met and married his mother, a nursing sister, during the First World War. John's guitar playing and easygoing manner had made him a popular sergeant. He was the apple of his mother's eye and had promised to write to her often. He also wrote to his childhood sweetheart, Magdalene Lizotte.
Dear Muggs, sometimes I don't think you appreciate the work I've been doing for the British Empire, to preserve peace and democracy on the earth for many a year to come. It's always been like this. They laughed at Columbus, poisoned Socrates, and now the army cooks are trying to poison me.
As they shipped out from Vancouver, there was little sense of foreboding. For most, it was an adventure. Some even lied about their age to get in, like Armand Bourbonniere of St. Boniface, Manitoba, who wanted to spite his mother.
Me? I like skating a lot. Hockey? I'm quite good at it. But my mother, hey, she gave my skates away. I got so mad, I joined the service. Oh, it wasn't long she got me out. I was underage. But I went back in again, so she left me there. Anyway, I got a brother, the oldest one. When he found out that I was back in there, he came. We're in the same regiment.
Kay Christie was one of 3 Canadian nursing sisters with the expedition.
Outside our cabin, they are giving them lectures, telling them what this end of the rifle is called, and where to put the bullet in. Honestly, it's just appalling.
After 3 weeks at sea, the Canadians arrived in Hong Kong on November 16, 1941. The 2,000 troops marched in to bolster the small British garrison. There was an air of unreality. The colony was only 6 weeks away from its centennial and expecting to prosper for decades to come under British might. But most of the British fleet was gone, leaving only a few naval vessels to help. There were 2 million people to defend, the colony swollen with Chinese refugees fleeing the advancing Japanese. Hong Kong was not just an island, but a chunk of mainland, including the city of Kowloon. The mainland territory stretched 40 kilometers to the Chinese border, where the Japanese army sat. Between the Japanese and most of the Hong Kong people was the main defense, stretching from Gin Drinkers Bay 11 miles through the mountains. A white ribbon of concrete, the Gin Drinkers line is still etched into the mountains overlooking a crucial freshwater reservoir. For a British army geared up for First World War type battles, the bunkers and tunnels with names like Charing Cross Road seemed a good idea. Sergeants Bob Clayton, Bob Manchester, and the rest of the Canadians didn't know of London's earlier calculation that these defenses would not survive long if the Japanese attacked. Bob Clayton remembers the British making fun of the enemy.
Somebody asked them, you know, if they thought the Japanese were going to do anything, and they just sounded like hell. They might miss a cup of tea while they were sending them back on their way, you know, but they weren't anything to worry about.
And they were saying, don't worry about the Japanese. They can't see at night. They all wear glasses. They have no Air Force and never flies at night.
We were more interested in the girls in Wan Chai than we were in the Japanese coming over the border.
Signs of the legendary nightlife of Hong Kong bring back memories for the 2 Canadian war veterans. Memories of the short, happy 3 weeks before war. Paid better than British soldiers, the Canadians were astonished at what their money would buy.
Everything was cheap. Beer was 10 cents a bottle. Rickshaw rides were 10 cents a crack. And you could pick up most anything for a good Canadian buck. Long time, short time, medium.
Hey, Robert, look at this hair.
And then, of course, there were the tattoo parlors. That's where Bob Clayton bought himself an indelible memory of his Hong Kong adventure, his regimental crest, and the word mother.
And he paints it on your arm, and then he just comes along with it.
That's what they do.
It hurt like hell, too. I guess they thought here we were a little nuts, you know. And the rickshaw guy, he's running right by the British soldier. He wants to get to the Canadian, because the Canadian ain't giving him a dime. He's giving him a Hong Kong dollar. You know, these guys wondered what struck them. Not only that, the Canadian ends up pulling the rickshaw guy up the street. The rickshaw guy's in the rickshaw, and the Canadian's got a hold of the shafts, and he's just trotting him right up there, you know.
In Hong Kong in 1941, the Chinese were assigned to pull rickshaws and serve their white masters. And just to survive, they had to learn to stay out of the path of British drivers. Ike Friesen of Manitoba was briefed on the rules of the road by a British officer.
He says, if you're driving down the streets in the city of Kowloon and you hit a Chinaman, you look back in your rearview mirror, and if he's still kicking, you back that truck up and run over him again. He says, Because if you send him to the hospital, it'll cost you the hospital bill. If you kill him, it'll only cost you $5 for burial. It's as simple as that. That's how much a Chinese coolie's life is worth.
The Canadians savored their leisure moments and wrote their first letters home. John Payne was enjoying this new adventure.
Dear Mother, so far so good. I'm not allowed to say where we are, but overall, it's top hole. For 60 cents a week Canadian, I have a houseboy to do my cleaning, washing, and odd jobs. With the guys, I celebrated my birthday over at a place called Jingles, which is something that my pockets didn't do when I got home. Tonight, I'm reading Dumas' Black Tulip. I'm seriously thinking of writing a book. If only I could think of a climax.
At the border with the rest of China, the curtain was about to rise on a tragedy. British intelligence estimated that there were only 5,000 Japanese soldiers in position to threaten Hong Kong. In fact, there were 10 times that many, 50,000 battle-hardened veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army assembling on the border. The 5-year land campaign in China gave them precious experience. Superior weapons and training gave them confidence. The Emperor gave them a cause.
When you encounter the enemy, regard yourself as if you're an avenger come face to face with his father's murderer. If you fail to destroy him utterly, you can never rest at peace.
In the early morning hours of Sunday, December 7th, the Japanese High Command ordered its forces into action across Asia. At 7:50 a.m. came the surprise attack on the American forces in Pearl Harbor. Overshadowed and often forgotten are the other Japanese attacks in the hours after Pearl Harbor: the Philippines, Malaya, and then Hong Kong.
I take a look up, and there's this V of airplanes coming over, and I heard a British voice say, "Oh, they must be up from Singapore." And we're looking at these, and all of a sudden, holy Jesus, these black Arctics started to drop out the bottom. Well, I'd never been bombed before, but I'm not stupid, you know. I was the first guy in the big ditch that's right beside the place. I was in there head first, and that deep ditch is deeper than I am.
At the Chinese border, Japanese ground troops crossed easily into Hong Kong territory. Soon there was an artillery duel with the retreating British. The sounds of his own shells, outgoing, are still vivid for Japanese mountain gunner Shigetoki Hosoki. But the Hong Kong veteran especially remembers British shells incoming. Under cover of artillery, the Japanese began a 40-kilometer trek towards the gin drinkers' line. The British calculated it would take a week, but 12 hours later, a Japanese patrol led by an enterprising officer reached the British position.
This officer had reconnoitered and found out that this was the main hinge on the line. When this went, the line went. That was the end of the line.
Unseen at the edge of the reservoir, the Japanese scanned this hill looking for signs of British troops. Suddenly, they saw underwear and socks waving in the breeze.
야, 驚きましたね. To our surprise, we spotted laundry drying on the line. And soon realized where to attack.
With grappling hooks, they scaled these cliffs and surprised the Scottish soldiers in the bunkers below.
They got up here and got to the ventilator shafts, and were still undetected. It was a complete surprise. And I can just imagine these fellows being in here. Some would be sleeping, they might be a few of them sitting up shooting a guff or something. And these Japanese are outside, and then they started dropping their grenades down into here. And it must have been an awful shock to these guys. And many a good Scotsman died down here.
Must have.
Yeah, a lot of good men went down here.
The gin drinkers' line was supposed to hold out for weeks. The Japanese took it in a few hours. The precious northern reservoir was now controlled by the Imperial Japanese Army, the colony's water supply in peril. The momentum of the battle was now with the Japanese, and soon they were on the outskirts of Kowloon, the mainland part of Hong Kong. The Winnipeg Grenadiers joined other defenders fighting a rearguard action. Everyone was handed a rifle, even Army telephone lineman Walter Jenkins.
Everybody gets the wind up, see? Hey, the Japs are coming down the road. This is the main road in Hong Kong, right? Everybody out. Everybody gets down there. They're behind these sandbags, right? I said to the sergeant, always an efficient sergeant around there, I says, hey, I haven't got a sandbag. Don't worry about it, it'll just get in your way. And I'm thinking, well, that's what I want the fucking thing for.
Everyone scrambled for a place on the few boats back from Kowloon to the island. Canadian troops commandeered the last ferry, but a 21-year-old Manitoba farm boy missed the boat. John Gray, the eldest of 7 children, was captured by the Japanese and executed. He became the first Canadian infantryman to die in combat in the Second World War. Shortly after the evacuation, the Japanese commanders paraded through the city of Kowloon with some of their other prisoners. And then most of the commanders turned the town over to their soldiers. All Chinese women were declared to be prostitutes and free. The raping and pillaging began. The Canadians just on the other side of this harbor could hear it all.
Well, it was horrible. The screams, and all night long was just, I don't know what they were doing when they got in there. I guess they were looting and everything else, but that whole city was just one massive scream all night long. Just raised the hair in the back of your head.
The Japanese propaganda leaflets dropped on the defenders promised fair play for anyone surrendering, but also accurately depicted the military situation. The Japanese firmly on the mainland, the smaller defending forces stranded and surrounded on Hong Kong Island. Then a peace mission was dispatched to the island with the message that surrender was the only way to avoid annihilation. The Japanese didn't have to wait long for their answer. After only 15 minutes, the British commander sent back his one-word answer: no. The stage was set for a desperate siege. The Canadians had often been assured that Hong Kong Island was an impregnable fortress. Now they were not so sure. On December 13, 1941, the Japanese began a 5-day bombardment of the island of Hong Kong, softening it up for the coming amphibious assault. The Japanese attackers were often as apprehensive as the defenders. Shuichi Kamata was there, a 22-year-old conscript commanding a 25-man platoon. He had heard that Hong Kong was a very strong castle that would take 100 years to destroy. And so as he prepared for the battle, he prepared for his own death. The British commanders had always expected an attack from the sea, and so had placed most of their fortifications at the bottom of the island. They still expected a Japanese attack from the sea, even though the enemy was now in control of the mainland on the other side. All the Japanese had to do was cross the harbor. Canada's Royal Rifles were placed at the narrowest crossing point, Limoon Passage. The British commanders said the Japanese would never come across the water at night. Canadians were assured that the Japanese were racially prone to seasickness. Because of their eye shape, their night vision was supposed to be poor. Both sides reduced the enemy to a racial caricature.
Westerners think themselves very superior people, but are really very effeminate and very cowardly. They have an intense dislike of fighting in the rain or at night. So, that is how we attack.
At 10 p.m. on December 18th, the Japanese crossed to the island. Royal Rifleman John Stroud was in his trench waiting.
It was dark. We heard someone coming, but he said, "Don't worry, it's me, Joe." And then he lunged and thrust his bayonet into my leg. It was a Jap, but he said, "It's me, Joe," in perfect English, not even an accent. And then the Japanese were all over us.
The Canadians found themselves under fire in the pitch black. John Payne phoned British headquarters to report that the Japanese had come ashore.
I got a British staff officer and told him the Japanese had landed. I said we needed artillery support, and quickly. He tells me there's no possibility the Japanese are on the island. We're commanded by these British imperial types. Some of them just don't trust us colonials. He actually told me that I must be dreaming.
On that first night of the invasion, as Bob Clayton was walking up this road at Limoon, he had his first encounter with the Japanese.
My platoon officer sent me down to pick up a flare pistol. This is 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, dark. I'm coming back up the road, and all of a sudden, right in front of me, a sheet of flame come up and hit me in the face. I spun around 3 times. I landed down on the road. I didn't feel any pain or anything, but I couldn't get up. I crawled up the road. I called for my platoon officer, and it's pitch black. And he said, "Did you get the flare pistols?" And I said, "No, sir." He said, "You'll have to go back and get them." I said, "I can't, I've been hit."
Clayton was dragged into a small bunker at Limoon and left alone.
About 10 minutes go by, and I thought, boy, when those Japs get in here, I'm going to get a short shift. I'm going to get the bayonet. So, you get the wind up, you know. And I had a hand grenade strapped on here, and I thought, hell, I took the hand grenade out, and I took the pin out of it. I thought this is easier than them getting in here. I was going to let the lever go and put the hand grenade up against my chest, you know. And then I had second thoughts, and I thought, well, that's a goddamn coward's way to do it. I might as well wait and take some of those bastards with me when they get in here. The next thing, in walks this Lieutenant Scott. And he says, "I come back to see if you were here." And he says, "Get on my back." And I got on his back, and we went out the door, and we started up the road, and I said, "Mr. Scott, I'll never forget you as long as I live." He says, "We'll have a drink on our side someday."
Clayton was brought to a nearby British field hospital.
And I still got the hand grenade in my hand, and there was an old Army major in there, a medical officer, you know. And the old Army major's bending over me, and finally he says, "What do you got in your hand?" I said, "I got a hand grenade, sir." He says, "Will it go off?" I said, she'll go off. I let go of her, boy. There's no pin in her. He said, holy Jesus. And so the next thing they come in, and I think it was Mulkey, took the grenade off me, and he made sure he had a hold of that lever. And that old limey officer, he just madder than hell then, you know. He says, whatever you do, anybody comes in here anymore, he says, I want them searched before they come in here. And believe it or not, just about a couple of minutes later, I heard that grenade go off. This bunker was on the side of a hill, and I guess they went around the corner and they threw that grenade down there, and I heard the damn grenade go off, eh? So it ended up, it was funny, but it wasn't very funny. But I'll never forget that Mr. Scott. He was a very, very brave man, because I'd have died that night in that.
What happened to him?
What happened to him? Well, we never got our drink together. They found Lieutenant Scott and Lieutenant Lister and 3 of our privates all tied together and bayoneted. That's what happened to him.
By the time British headquarters accepted that the attack was real, the Japanese had landed 7,500 soldiers on the island of Hong Kong. They streamed over in boats of every description. Seasickness was not a problem. Many of the Japanese soldiers rather enjoyed their short boat ride over to the island. Some even remember singing along the way. Infantryman Shinsuke Adachi recalls singing a sentimental samurai song about a soldier pining for his mother. The Japanese forces swept across the channel from the mainland and rolled the defenders back up the mountains in the center of the island. A key battle took place at the central mountain pass called the Wangnechong Gap. Today it's still the only way through the center of the island. Sergeant Bob Manchester's fight was here with the Winnipeg Grenadiers.
There must have been at least a dozen officers, NCOs, and other ranks which operated this command post. This is West Brigade Command Post.
The Canadian commander was killed at his headquarters here early in the battle. Handfuls of grenadiers struggled to keep the high ground and surprise the Japanese below them.
The battle is bloody and desperate. 100 grenadiers are holding off 2 Japanese regiments. The guys who've never thrown a grenade are acquiring some experience.
And the Japanese machine gun that was over on top of the hill, he opened up again, and just at that time, I got smacked in the arm, and the marks on my forearm are still here. There are 4 holes that went through at that point.
I got hit. I'm burning. I'm numb. Jap sniper got me. So I'll just lie quiet here for a while. Jap sniper come out to see if you die or if you got gold in your mouth. I'm waiting for him. I got a new magazine in my stand. So I let him come. I let him come real close. I emptied it in his body. I got him right here. I made a hole right here. But I wasn't satisfied, so I chomped his head in. You wouldn't believe the grudge you get after a while.
We were outnumbered by 50 to 1 at least. We had hung on in this particular position for about 4.5 days. And we were now running out of ammunition and food.
The Japanese soldiers were ordered to make a series of suicide attacks against the Canadian positions. They suffered 800 casualties to win the battle at Wangnichang Gap. When the Japanese discovered how few defenders had caused this decimation, the field commander was forced to apologize to his superiors. The grenadiers and others rounded up as prisoners were now in danger. Some Japanese soldiers wanted revenge.
The Japanese came in, moved us out of the compound. They told us that the war was over as far as we were concerned. We asked about the wounded and could we take them with us. And they said, no, definitely not. Leave them here. We'll take good care of them. So they did real good care of them. They went in and put bayonets in them, shot them, and then they burnt the whole works that were left.
After the war crimes investigators went looking for evidence of that execution. Here, near this stream in the Wangnichang Gap, they found the bones of the murdered Canadian and British soldiers. John Osborne won the Victoria Cross, the Empire's highest award for bravery, for his part in the defense of Wangnichang Gap. He was a Winnipeg Grenadier, killed 2 days before Christmas in 1941. The battle was still not over. Many more Canadians would join him in the days ahead. This is St. Stephen's College, a Hong Kong private school in the British tradition. During the siege of Hong Kong in 1941, the gleaming floors of the library here were covered with almost 100 badly wounded British and Canadian soldiers. It was a temporary field hospital, staffed by 2 doctors and 11 nurses. This is where 19-year-old Bob Clayton was brought 2 days before Christmas, 1941. The Japanese grenade that exploded at his feet made it impossible for him to walk. He would spend a week in this building, and during that time he would witness an event so cruel, so brutal, that he would be marked by it for the rest of his life.
Sorry.
Okay. Where did they put you? Do you remember when you were brought in?
Yeah.
Would have laid you down?
I'd been wounded in both legs, and then coming up here, they fired on the ambulance, and I got wounded again in the face. And I guess it was all covered in blood, and they brought me in here and put the stretcher on the floor, or maybe it was a bed, I don't know. And this lady come over, she was a volunteer nurse. I guess she'd be 40 years old. And she come over and knelt down beside me and looked at me, and I'll never forget the look on her face. I'll never forget it. And it was like she was saying, boy, oh boy, what's this kid doing here? And then she went away, and she come back with a bucket of water or a pail of water or whatever it was, and washed my face all off and washed my legs all off. And
asked me if there's anything that I'd like, and I said I'd like to have a hot chocolate if they had any. So she went and got me a hot chocolate. She said, "You try to go to sleep now."
This young lad, Bud Sweet, from Bathurst, New Brunswick, was asleep in my ward. Freckles across his nose and a lock of hair. He looks as though he should be out playing marbles or something. And here he is, with his left arm off, right up to the shoulder. And he doesn't know yet. And I'm thinking, dear God, what am I gonna tell you when you come to? Bud began to stir. He looked at his shoulder. And he said, "How am I doing?" I said, "You're doing just fine." He said, "You mean what's left of me is doing fine?" I said, "That's exactly it." He said, "Well, that's kind of the way I figured." And he just turned aside and went to sleep.
Outside, the battle raged on. Every hour brought more Japanese troops onto the island. On Christmas Eve 1941, among the wounded, the dead, and the dying at St. Stephen's Hospital was Laurie McKay.
Christmas Eve. The place was filled with beds. People hit really bad. They were beating this one fellow, trying to bring him out of shell shock. You couldn't sleep. We could hear machine gun fire as the Japanese got closer. Geez, I was thinking, I gotta get out of here. But I waited too long.
Bob Clayton was upstairs in St. Stephen's when the Japanese closed in on the hospital at 5:30 a.m. on Christmas Day.
Our wounded were laying in bed there. And just before they broke into the hospital, there was a hell of a commotion outside. And I heard a guy holler, "For Christ's sake, don't let those bastards get in this hospital." When the Japanese came through the door, the doctors met them, and they had their hands up.
The doctors tried to surrender the hospital, but they killed them. And the Japanese soldiers started killing all around me. I said, "Oh my God, this is it." I pulled the blankets over my head. One Jap ran over me to bayonet the guy in the next bed. And I rolled off my mattress. And I made a run for the door. And I was hit over the head. I went arse over tea kettle. I don't remember a thing till I came to, and this Red Cross nurse was trying to stop this Japanese soldier from killing us. So the soldier grabs her by the throat and drags her away.
The surviving nurses and soldiers like Laurie McKay and Bob Clayton were dragged down this corridor in the school's dormitory. Separating the nurses, the Japanese jammed more than 60 wounded and terrified soldiers into this dorm. One after the other, soldiers were taken out, tortured and dismembered with swords. The raping of the nurses began.
They kept coming back to the room and firing into it. The fear had really set into me. I had my head down. And this old First World War vet says to me, "Look, kid, we're going to die today. But one thing we're going to do, we're going to die like Canadians. Don't be scared of them."
It was Christmas Day, and you're thinking about home, and I thought of my mother a million times, and I knew she'd be going crazy, absolutely crazy, which I found out after. Anyway, you do stupid things, and I sat on sitting there on the floor, and I kept saying, "Ma, I'm all right. Ma, I'm all right."
And this Jap soldier came in. He says, "Canada!" And I says, "Yeah. The hell with you. Go ahead, you bastard. Kill me." He looks at me. He starts kicking me. And then he says, "Canada!" "Cowboy?" I says to myself, "What's going on here?" So I say, "Yeah. Cowboy." So he steps back, and he twirls his hand over his head like a lariat, and he yells, "Whoa! Ho! Ho, ho, ho! Yip, yip, yip!" And then he tells me to stand up. And quick draw. All night he kept bringing back his friends and telling me to quick draw.
5,000 miles across the Pacific, in Toronto, it was early Christmas morning.
My mom and dad are laying in bed, and my mother shakes my dad and wakes him up and said, "Rob, Bobby was right in this room. He was saying, 'Ma, I'm all right. Ma, I'm all right.'" My dad told her she was hearing things. She sure did. She said after that she never worried again, and she never did.
He came back later and brought me a pack of cigarettes. A picture of Deanne Durbin, an alarm clock. The cigarettes I really appreciated. The alarm clock, I didn't know how long I was going to need. And the picture of Deanne Durbin, well, I guess they knew she was Canadian, too.
Outside, Clayton's regiment was ordered by the British to make a suicide charge to retake the high ground around St. Stephen's. They were annihilated.
Jackie Lyons Henry's brother died down there. Len Latimer died down there. But at least they died fighting. What those bastards did in here, I'll never forget.
Five of the 7 nurses at St. Stephen's, including the one who gave Clayton hot chocolate, were raped and killed. Of the 93 wounded soldiers, 63 were murdered by the Japanese. Many captives, like Bob Clayton, were spared, but during the battle, official Japanese policy was to take no prisoners. In the afternoon of Christmas Day, with much of Hong Kong in flames, the British realized that further resistance was futile. At 3 p.m., the British commanders officially surrendered to the forces of Imperial Japan. The Union Jack was lowered. On the day after Christmas in Hong Kong, the Japanese commanders paraded in triumph through the streets of the city. The defenders of Hong Kong, from Britain, India, and Canada, were now prisoners of war. Some appeared almost jovial, happy at least to have survived. Many expected to be treated civilly, according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. They were sadly mistaken. Over the next 3.5 years of captivity, many of the living would come to envy the dead. This is the Sham Shui Po prison camp near the center of Hong Kong. After the British colony fell to the Japanese in December of 1941, this is where Canadian prisoners of war were incarcerated. More recently, this prison camp has been used to hold illegal Vietnamese immigrants to Hong Kong, boat people.
One thing, Robert, it brings back a lot of bad memories, I'm going to tell you.
Yeah.
Canadian veterans Bob Clayton and Bob Manchester found it hasn't changed very much since they lived here 50 years ago.
But imagine having to put up with those things.
Yeah,
and,
well.
bedding. It has a real smell of old death in there.
Yeah, you're darn right. It was someplace.
Yeah. I see the backdrop of the houses are still the same, eh?
Just the same as when we marched out there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, look, just the same.
The Canadian prisoners were marched into this camp after the Hong Kong battle. They had no idea how long they'd be staying or what their life would be like. Some thought the greatest enemy would be boredom. Armand Bourbonniere of St. Boniface was determined to make a decent life for himself and his brother Hector.
When they took us to the camp from the hospital, they told us to take all that we could carry. So I got this big mattress. I got sheets, pillows, and these soup bowls. So I'm thinking of my brother. So one day, I begged him to come and move in with me. He says no. I mean, I brought utensils and a bowl for him. Then he moves in with me. He spends a couple of weeks. And then he got mad and he took off. And then he sold his bowl for cigarettes. I got so mad. I have a real hard time with him. And I tried to help him and everything. But he just doesn't seem to appreciate what I do for him.
There are few films or photographs of life inside the Sham Shui Po prison camp. These drawings by Hong Kong veterans provide a rare visual record. The prisoners were warehoused in a steaming, crowded barracks. One of the artists was John Payne.
There's a lot of talk in the camp that we're going to be liberated before too long by the Brits or the Americans or somebody. I wouldn't bet on it. I've given this place 100 days. I won't be alone going over the wire.
Still close to the Sham Shui Po camp is Hong Kong's international airport, Kai Tak. Few modern travelers realize the runway here was built by Canadian and other prisoners of war under threat of starvation. Winnipeg Grenadier Les Canavet worked on that runway.
The tarmac we built was about the worst piece of concrete you'd ever seen. We sabotaged it by mixing all kinds of sand in with the concrete to make it weak. When the first Japanese aircraft landed there, it was a large aircraft with a fighter escort with VIPs on board. Crashed on landing because the tarmac gave way. You see, the Japanese engineer turned the project over to a British engineer because he didn't want to be bothered with it. I can recall them bringing that Japanese engineer out, and the officer in charge just chopped his head off right there. We thought we were in for the chopping because we were the ones that did the work. But we got away quite clean.
The prisoners may have lost the battle, but were determined to stand tall. One of their jailers was bent on crushing that spirit, a member of the Japanese Gestapo, the Kemputai, Kaneo Inoue.
And all of a sudden, this son of a bitch comes along and he looks us all up and he's walking up and down and we're looking at this guy. You know, he's something new. We never seen him before. Oh, he stops and he looks at us all and he says, "So you're the Canadians, eh?" Just like that. Well, Jesus, we're looking at this guy now. He says, "I want you to know," he says, "I was born and raised in Kamloops, BC, and I hate your goddamn guts."
Inoue was a Canadian who left home and enlisted in the Japanese military. He was known as the Kamloops Kid.
He wanted to get guys that were out from around where he came from, you know. And he said when he was a kid and growing up there, they'd call him, "You little yellow bastard," and stuff like this. So he never forgot that.
John Stroud.
Another fella and I get a hold of a baseball, trying to keep in shape. Around the corner comes the Kamloops Kid. He says, "I throw the ball." So, I throw it to him. He throws it back a little harder. I throw it back harder. Now, I've pitched a lot of balls in my life, so around the fourth try, I put a curve on it. He misses it with his hands, and I hit him in the face. He pulls out his fucking sword and nicks me on the forehead. Then he says, "That'll teach you, you smart bastard."
One of our officers, Captain Norris, who was the regimental quartermaster, he decided that he was going to approach this authority and say he wanted clothing and boots, particularly for the men if they were going to go out to work. And the Kamloops Kid just worked him over for a good 15, 20 minutes until he was bleeding in all his ears, his face, his shoulders. It was a disgusting situation to witness.
At least 2 weakened Canadians died after beatings by Inoue. Officers protested brutality towards prisoners, but the Japanese were unmoved. In fact, the treatment of officers was one part of the Geneva Convention honored by the Japanese. The officers got special privileges, and this sowed trouble with soldiers like Fred Reich.
So 2% of the men here are officers. And they buy 95% of the food that the Japs bring. We can't buy any food at the canteen because the officers have bought it all. And they put barbed wire around their huts to hoard this bloody food. We work, and they lay in their bunks. And they smoke. And they flick half cigarettes out into this area that if you're a smoker, you're dying for a smoke, you know? So one day, Harry Robinson, good friend of mine, he walked into the gate, picked up a couple butts, and this guy used to be a cook, and they made him a sergeant. He tells Robinson to drop the butts, and Harry tells him, "You can kiss my ass." And they brought him up on charge. And old Tris, our senior officer, he gives him 3 weeks detention, not for picking up the butts, but for disobeying an order. Yeah, prison camp, given to him by a cook. So they put him in the shack. He was only there 2.5 weeks. In the last couple of days, he got dysentery, so they took him to the dysentery hospital. He only lasted 4 or 5 days there. He was dead and buried.
The beatings and the relentless hours of work took their toll on body and spirit. But over time, nothing did more damage than the slow starvation that came from a single ration, morning, noon, and night.
We're getting just straight rice. That's all it was, straight rice. You had a leak about 15 times a day because this rice, that's all it was water, you know, so you were going to the benjo all the time. And it got so when you got up, everything would go black in front of your eyes.
The rice diet caused medieval diseases, stripping the lining of the brain, stopping the kidneys working, slowly killing.
I used to go around and see my guys in the hospital, and one of the first fellows in my platoon to die was Clarence Wilbur. I went over to see Clarence, and he says, "How are things going?" I said, "There's all kinds of them coming. The Americans are on their way back, and we're going to be out of here in a short bloody time." Well, he says, "They better hurry, Sarge," and he threw back the blanket. His testicles and balls were that big from wet berry. It had come up that far on him. And this berry, the wet berry, you could put your fingers into your leg anywhere or wherever you had it, and the imprint would still be there the next day. Then we had the dry berry. I had that, and it's like somebody's taking a knife and shoving it in the bottom of your feet. You know, you had hot feet all the time. And the things got so bad with the guys with the hot feet keeping the other guys awake, they put them all in one ward, and we called it the agony ward.
This would have been the solution. These Red Cross parcels of food and medicine were packed by thousands of mothers back home for the prisoners, but few got through to the Hong Kong Canadians. Most were stolen and sold on the black market by racketeers. This man did most of the stealing, the Hong Kong camp commander, Colonel Sasso Tokunaga. A diphtheria epidemic deepened the agony. The Japanese camp doctor had serum, but withheld it. Men volunteered to care for buddies, knowing the plague might kill them. Sometimes it did. Diphtheria killed 108 Canadians. Armand Bourbonniere was trying to save his brother.
My brother, he got bad with malnutrition. All crippled with sores and bloated with berry. So
I squeezed through the fence, and I snuck in to see him. He was finished. So I gave this military shirt to this Chinese in exchange for some powdered milk. And I mixed it in a can with some water. That soybean milk. And I wanted him to drink it. But he wouldn't do it. He'd given up. So I grabbed him by the collar and I said, "You drink this, or I'll finish you myself." So I just shoved it in. He gagged and everything. And then I left. Sent to Japan. I figured he'd never live. Because he gave up.
The prisoners heard in August 1942 that many of them would be sent to Japan. 4 of them decided that now was the time to try and escape. John Payne was the leader. On the day of the attempt, he wrote this letter to his mother in Winnipeg.
Dear Mother, I have decided to take a chance on getting out. There are numerous reasons for the step, the chief being that the cholera and the fly season is starting. And anyway, I'm ruddy sick of Japanese hospitality.
John Payne made this drawing to help plan the escape. On a dark night, a ladder was placed to get them over the wire. They got into a nearby sampan and made a break across the water.
You share my views on fatalism, so I know you won't condemn my judgment. Just in case I shouldn't make it, you must remember that according to our beliefs, I have departed for a much nicer place, I hope. Although it will grieve me to exchange a guitar for a harp. But enough of this drivel. I'll be able to destroy this note myself, I'm sure. So, bye-bye for now. Your devoted son, John.
Halfway across, they got caught in a tide or something, and the Japanese picked them up there. It was quite a few days before we found out that they had been caught, but they were either shot and beheaded or beheaded anyway, and I imagine they suffered a hell of a lot before they finally done away with them, because they were that type of people, you know. And right after that, they put us in groups of 10, and if one of you escaped, they said they would kill the other 9, and we didn't doubt it for one bit. It would happen. That's what they would do.
After 1 year in the prison camps of Hong Kong, Canadian prisoners of war like Bob Clayton were put onto ships and sent to Japan.
The ship that we came over on wasn't much bigger than that one going right there. There were 500 of us. We were marched on board the ship in Hong Kong and down into the hold. They crammed as many of us down there as we could. And when I mean down in the hold, I mean down in the hold. All there was the bottom deck. That's where we were. That's where we stayed. I just don't know how long it took us to get over here to Japan, but it took us quite a while. And when we docked, and they brought us up out of the hold, we must have been something else. We couldn't smell each other because we were down there, but when we come up and them buggers were up on the top deck with their hands over their nose like that, and I was looking at them and thinking, well, we'll have our day.
For almost 3 years, Canadians worked as slave laborers in a giant shipyard near Tokyo. Here, many of the vessels for Japan's war fleet were built and launched, and still are today by the same corporation that operated the shipyard during the war, NKK Nippon Kokan, a flourishing Japanese multinational. Bob Clayton worked here for over a year. Now he can find almost no trace that Canadians were ever present. But the veterans have no trouble remembering the conditions they lived in. The men were filthy, starving, but always determined to survive.
Hey, the rats are big. Just like cats. Around the holidays, we caught 22. So for Christmas dinner, we cooked our rats. But we took the meat, eating it, and the juice. It's fat. So we figure we got protein. We drink the juice. Vitamins, eh? Big idea. We're like a bunch of kids. So the next day, we go to work. And sick, dab. Every 2 minutes, we got to go to the lavatory. Diarrhea, you could believe it. And every time we come back, the Japanese civilian in charge of us, well, we're not doing any work. We're just running to the lavatory. He beat us up steady. So I never ate any more rats after that. Oh, but they were good. Just like chicken.
This card from home topped off Christmas dinner. All Canada joins in warmest Christmas greetings and good wishes to you. It came from the politician who sent them to Hong Kong. W.L. Mackenzie King, Prime Minister. "500 miles north of Tokyo were another group of Canadians. Bob Manchester came to Niigata hoping for the best. This was his home for 3 years. And here he would leave many of these buddies. The horror started innocently enough, with lineups. Lineups for pictures. Lineups for slave labor in the coal yards. Line up and be counted, sounding out your number in Japanese.
Ich, ni, san, shi, go, roko, sichi, hachi, hati, ju, juichi. And if you goofed, if any one of those men along the line goofed by mucking up their number, and bang, over his head went we start all over again.
John Stroud was one of the first to arrive.
The first thing you have to learn in Japan is benjo. That's the Japanese word for outhouse. Christ, some of them are just kids. They can't even remember the word. So I tell them, just think of the musical instrument. Banjo. Well, at night, they go to the guard, and they say, guitar. Ukulele. Oh, what the hell did Stroud tell us? And then the guard beats them.
One day, the guards caught Manchester's friend John Mortimer and accused him of stealing a tin of salmon. They beat him savagely.
Then they staked him out in the compound for about a week. He had gangrene set in his feet and hands.
Mortimer died a lingering death, finished off by exposure. In the Niigata camp on the northwest coast of Japan, the winter of 1943 was one of the harshest ever. The Canadian prisoners were dressed in soggy grass capes and had to move tons of coal each day. After tropical Hong Kong, winter was unexpectedly savage for men facing starvation.
Tell you how we sleep? Partners. One guy sleeps for a few hours, and so he won't freeze to death. You wake him up, and then you sleep. Last week, his friend went to sleep. The fellow didn't wake him up, so his friend froze to death.
The big thing was pneumonia. You got pneumonia, you just died. That's all there was to it. And it didn't, funny thing, it didn't only happen to you in the wintertime, it happened to you in the summertime. I was working out here and it was August, 1943. And all of a sudden, I can't get my breath. Just happened that quick, bang. And Tarby, my buddy I was working with, said, "What's the matter, Flash?" And I said, "I don't know, I can't get my breath, you know." So anyway, I had to come up the road here to the Japs and went in to see the guards, and they looked me over and put me in a cart and took me into camp. I went into camp and I saw Captain Reed, and he said, "Flash, get your clothes and go in there." That's like saying you're on your way to the crematorium, you know. I kept saying to myself, I'm coming out of this goddamn place.
Because the Japanese authorities were withholding medicine, there was little any Canadian Army doctor could do.
Pretty hard seeing your buddies die, and I can remember Lyle Ellis dying and Jimmy Emo dying and Murray Goodenough dying, and I can remember Doc Reed crying because he couldn't do anything, eh?
At Clayton's camp and here at Niigata, the death rate skyrocketed. It was 6 times higher than the death rate at POW camps in Germany.
Doc Reed said, "Flash, we have to take these fellas to the crematorium." We stood there while they shoved them in box and all. So one of they didn't even save the bloody wood. There was rice balls around there and some fish, and we were pinching it, you know, kind of sneak some of it. We were hungry as hell. And one of the guys said, "Jesus, Flash, if they catch us, we'll go into crematorium alive." I said, "Well, hell, we'll go in full anyway," you know, so a little bit of humor with a hell of a lot of tragedy, you know.
Many of the Japanese that live and work in the neighborhood near the old prison camp have a different view of the treatment given Canadians and other prisoners. 80-year-old Mr. Kawata worked in the shipyard during the war, and he stayed on for many years with the NKK company. He was interested in meeting the Canadian veterans, and he even had some souvenir pictures that he wanted to show them.
Some memorial photo at the time.
They're photographs of the
camp.
There were pictures of the POWs lined up outside their barracks. Pictures of the prisoners supposedly having a party.
Christmas party.
Christmas party? That's all. Tell them they don't look too happy. There isn't any of them smiling.
They were old propaganda pictures from the neighboring American POW camp, for which the prisoners were forced to stage happy-looking occasions.
No.
Yeah, Christmas.
Mr. Kawata wanted to point out the very good treatment given prisoners.
They could receive many cakes or something.
Many cakes? Tell them they were lucky.
Yeah.
We didn't get them. Yeah. Was he a guard there or?
そこで桑田さんのお仕事は何でしたでしょうか。その収容所の中で。
He was a guard. He pointed himself out in the picture. He was the captain of the guards. But he said that he only worked in administration.
I would like to know, how does he think that the POWs were treated in his camp? What did he think about the treatment?
それについてはやっぱりどう思われますか。もっとやっぱ。
Mr. Kawata allowed us how there were some problems there.
Sometimes the difference of the cultures and the customs.
Well, it isn't a custom to be hungry all the time, too. I guess a lot of POWs died in his camp.
桑田さんのその第5とか第9の。Just one, he remembered.
One?
One. He got sick and died.
He got sick. Oh, he got sick and died. I think this gentleman has a poor memory there. Well, many men died in our camp there. Many, many. I took 4 out one time myself to the crematorium, pulling them in a cart. If you got pneumonia, you just died. So it had to be the same in his camp.
で、彼のいたここの 3D では第3ではたくさん彼は見たそうです。 He didn't hear about that.
He never heard about it.
He didn't know that.
No,
about that.
oh, that's all right.
このね、第三州での
They never
所長
remember. I know.
鷲見清太郎から亡くなってしまったから
Yeah, maybe
나중에
the difference of the culture or something, they couldn't understand each other. That's why they had a responsibility for it.
We couldn't understand them either.
だという
Nippon Kokan and its founder Morishiro Shiaishi made millions of dollars profiting from the Japanese war effort, partly from using Canadian prisoners as slave laborers. In similar circumstances, German corporations have paid billions of dollars in compensation to wartime workers. Japanese companies are being pressed by Canada's veterans for compensation, but refuse even to discuss the issue. In Japan, there's no official account of the conduct of the Imperial Japanese Army during and after the battle for Hong Kong. The dark events of the Second World War are not even taught in the schools. These soldiers fought in Hong Kong, and they're now prepared to talk about it. They come to the controversial Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, a relic of the old potent marriage between the Shinto religion and Japanese militarism. They perform an old samurai ritual, calling up the spirits of their fallen comrades. Shinsuke Adachi still believes in the Bushido code. Surrender, he says, shames one's family. He can't understand the Canadians who did it. Suicide with a knife, harakiri, is the warrior's way out. Shuichi Kamata, on the other hand, envied the fact that Canadians could surrender. Facing the Royal Rifles at Stanley, he was ordered to make suicide charges until his platoon of 25 were all killed or badly wounded. He suffered gunshot wounds in the left arm and leg, and still carries 3 pieces of an exploding Canadian hand grenade in his bag. That was his Christmas Day, same day as the St. Stephen's Massacre. The Japanese soldiers were eager to discuss the Hong Kong battle with their old Canadian opponents.
Field guns caused us a lot of trouble.
And so Bob Manchester agreed to meet with them at a restaurant in Tokyo.
I'm glad.
You did a good job.
Well, field gun. And you were firing down in the small gun. Yeah, right. That's right.
For a while, there was a mood of comradeship at the dinner. Old soldiers trading stories about how the battle looked from their vantage point.
That point.
Then Mr. Adachi produced some enlarged pictures of the battle locations from 1941. Bob Manchester asked to see the St. Stephen's College Hospital, where the atrocity took place on Christmas Day.
That one building might be the hospital he remembers.
Yeah, this one here. This one here. Yeah. My friend is here with me. He was supposed to visit with tonight, but he was so upset because he and all the other Canadians that were in this hospital were, they were being treated for their wounds, and the Japanese came in and killed mostly all of the men that were in the hospital. And my friend refused to come down tonight because he's so upset about the whole incident.
These men said they had nothing to do with that incident, and in fact claimed they were hearing the story of this Japanese atrocity for the first time. Shuichi Kamata's first reaction seemed one of deep regret. The others appeared more ambivalent.
When it came down to the questions of atrocities, the blind seemed to come down, and there was a sudden silence of thought and silence of action. And you can appreciate that. I mean, No warrior, whether they had committed atrocities themselves or had witnessed or heard any of their chums talk about atrocities, is going to admit that, least of all to strangers.
In the summer of 1945, most of the Canadians were sent down to work in Japanese coal mines. In those last days of the war, the Emperor's military leaders were planning one last crime. If Japan was invaded, all prisoners of war would be executed. The end, however, came far more quickly than the Emperor's men had anticipated. In August 1945, atomic bombs killed 120,000 Japanese. The prisoners say the bomb ended their agony and saved their lives. The secret plan to execute them was dropped. This is how Canadians like Roger Sear learned their fate.
We came up from the mine to the surface. The Japs had rigged loudspeakers to utility poles, and they made us sit around in a circle. And we heard this voice, this disembodied voice came on the air. I didn't understand what the hell he was saying. It was a sort of Japanese I couldn't understand. So one of the foremen was sort of interpreting for us, and he said, "That's the Emperor."
The broadcast of Hirohito's surrender speech from the Imperial Palace was the first time that most Japanese had ever heard the Emperor's voice. He told them they must learn to bear the unbearable, that the enemy had developed a weapon so powerful there was no other choice but surrender. The prison hospitals in Hong Kong and Japan were filled with men at the edge of death. Those who survived would never fully recover from their ordeal. The Canadian POWs were brought out to American ships like the USS Wisconsin, anchored in Tokyo Bay, where thousands of sailors watched them come aboard. The American forces on the Wisconsin wanted to give special welcomes to each of the POWs brought aboard, so individual U.S. sailors like machinist mate Bob Grillo were assigned to take care of Canadian soldiers of equivalent rank. When Sergeant Bob Clayton walked up this gangplank in 1945, he was assigned to Bob Grillo. More than 4 decades later, they meet again.
How you doing, Robert? Permission to come aboard. I never asked you that 45 years ago. And I'm not hungry this time.
and you're not that same little skinny kid either.
No, I'm not.
You're looking great.
What happened to you?
The same thing happened to you. You look good.
Never forgot you guys and what you did for us. And wonderful. Just wonderful. Okay.
For Bob Clayton, the strongest impression was left by the American officer who took command of the prisoners as they came aboard.
So, and he said, "Sailor, you look at that soldier. Soldier, you look at that sailor." So you and I are looking at each other. He says, anything he wants, you get it for him. And if it isn't on this ship, you go and get it for him. That's right. He said, you look after him, and he can eat 24 hours a day. Now, he said, I'm going to tell you something else. You're the hungriest looking bunch of bastards I ever saw in my life, he said, and we're going to do something about it right now. And if I can remember right, but I met so many years ago, but I think they just put some tables out right along here.
Yeah, and put some food
and
out.
we sat down, and the guy they come out with the bacon and eggs. I think the guy served them with a pitchfork. You know, they just boom, it hit the.
Well, you didn't have a chow fish. How can we bring you down below?
And you'd only finish one egg, and he'd be back with about two more. And we had the bacon, we had toast, and I think half of us got sick. You know, we weren't used to that grease. But I'll never forget that, and I'll never forget how good you guys were.
That away, here. Roach.
Captain on your ship, we just died.
The American Navy transported the Canadians back to North America. The men looked forward to putting lives back together. One Winnipeg grenadier searched for a brother he left near death in Hong Kong, Armand Bourbonniere.
You know where I saw him again? San Francisco. The Navy gave me this sailor uniform, so he doesn't recognize me. And I didn't tell him. He started to talk to me about the brother he lost. Me? Then we got on a train to Seattle. And then I said, would you like to meet your brother again? He goes, is he alive? I go, yeah. I'm your brother. So he started crying.
In October 1945, 4 years after they left Canada, the Hong Kong veterans were finally home again.
And then when I arrived, there were 68 of my relatives, and it was 8 o'clock in the morning, you know. And it was pretty emotional. Ma started to cry, and I said, hey, Ma, I'm home now, you know. And then when I arrived at my place, all the time I was away, it was Christmas Day when I arrived home. It was October, but it was Christmas Day. My dad had cooked up geese, because I love goose, you know. And he had, I don't know how many pumpkin pies. The street was blocked off. And all the time I was away, my mother put my Christmas presents under the Christmas tree. And then with many a tear, I guess she picked them up and put them in the cupboard, you know, till I come back. And when I come back, I got those presents. So she never had any doubts that I wasn't coming back.
The Winnipeg Grenadiers sailed into Victoria, Bob Manchester in the middle of them. He had a joyful reunion with his mother and wife Edna, but always the soldier, Manchester had taken on a heartbreaking assignment. John Payne's family, his mother Margaret, sisters Diane, Yvonne, and brother Ben, still weren't sure about his fate.
One of the very, very difficult situations was to pay my respects to that family. They were very, very anxious to know just what did take place.
Before the war, the Paynes had celebrated with some grenadiers, including the guy on the floor, Bob Manchester. Now he was coming back into their home, carrying John Payne's last words. The letter was grimy and sweat-stained from years being hidden under Manchester's clothes.
Dear Mother, I have decided to take a chance on getting out. You share my views on fatalism, although it will grieve me to exchange a guitar for a harp. But enough of this drivel. Your devoted son, John. P.S. Best regards to Di and Yvonne. Tell Ben to join the Air Force next war.
Some Canadian veterans returned to Japan to join the international team hunting for Japanese war criminals. A few hundred scapegoats were rounded up and prosecuted. The commandant of the Hong Kong prison camp was convicted of John Payne's murder and other crimes. Colonel Isao Takunaga was sentenced to hang, but that was commuted to 20 years imprisonment. At St. Stephen's, a nurse who survived the atrocity tried unsuccessfully to identify Japanese soldiers responsible for some of the murders and rapes. The Japanese army commander in Hong Kong was convicted of murder for ordering the execution of prisoners. Major General Tanaka was sentenced to hang, but the sentence was eventually commuted. Kaneo Inoue was found guilty of beating Canadian soldiers to death. At first, his conviction was overturned on the grounds Canada couldn't try a Canadian citizen for war crimes. Then he was tried and convicted of treason, and in 1947, he was hanged in Hong Kong. While some Canadians focused their anger against the Japanese, men like Roger Sear blamed the Canadian government for sending them on the hopeless mission to begin with.
As a soldier, I have no problem with being sent to war. It doesn't bother me. What frightens the daylights out of me? The thought that my government would have, not only willingly, but very actively placed itself in a situation where it would knowingly offer a couple of thousand of its young men as lambs to the slaughter in order to meet some sort of political expediency.
In 1941, these Canadian soldiers offered their lives to their country and entrusted their fate to their government. That trust was betrayed. In the years after the war, as they struggled with the physical and psychological aftermath of their imprisonment, the Canadian government made them plead for each small increase in medical benefits and war pensions. The Canadian prison camp survivors made a claim for reparations from Japan, but in 1952, without their permission, the Canadian government legally absolved Japan of any responsibility. At the Saiwan Bay Cemetery in Hong Kong, the Canadian veterans are honored visitors. On major anniversaries of the battle, the Canadian sacrifice is remembered with full military honors. The bugle is played, uniforms are worn, and guns are fired in salute over the Canadian graves. In the Hodogaya Cemetery in Japan, the guns are forbidden, and the Canadian Embassy has told the veterans if they insist on bringing a bugle, it must be hidden in a paper bag, all for fear of offending the Japanese. In 1991, the Japanese Prime Minister informally apologized to the Canadian war veterans, but the Japanese government and corporations still refuse to pay any compensation, and the Canadian government continues to oppose the veterans' right to have it. The Commonwealth Military Cemetery at Stanley is near St. Stephen's Hospital, where Canadian soldiers were massacred in Hong Kong.
They'll get something from their family on the bottom.
There are 19 Canadians in this small cemetery, not counting the unknown soldiers, often buried more than one to a grave.
There's 12 of them there, Robert. Mm-hmm.
When they returned from the war, some of the survivors were outraged when they heard of printed accusations in Britain that Canadians broke and ran in the Hong Kong battle, that Canadians were to blame for the fall of the colony. They knew it was a lie, and yet many had trouble bringing themselves to tell the story of what really happened to the families of their dead comrades.
What you tried to do, of course, when you were talking with the relatives, give the better side of the picture rather than the horrors of the actual fighting or the prison camp situation.
I didn't even tell my own mother everything. I never told her anything about the bad times or how bad it was in camp or anything else. I had, well, to tell you the truth, I didn't want to talk about it too much. Even Lieutenant Scott that saved my life, I'm sorry to say I didn't write his wife and tell her what I thought of him till about 2 years ago.
Why is that?
I guess I just wanted to forget it, that's all.
So we tried to provide a reasonable explanation as to
I don't know why, cut it out, Bob. I don't know why Bob and I got picked to come here. Any of the fellas could have came here. A couple of episodes, we've had some fun, laughed down on the streets, but the majority of it has been no laugh. I've been very, very, very proud to serve with this brigade, both in the fighting and in prison camp. And I'd like to say to them, wherever you are, and wherever you go, you can say, I'm a Hong Kong veteran, and hold your head up high.